Ja, schönen guten Abend. Wir warten noch ganz kurz, dass sich alle Audiosignale verbunden haben, damit Sie mich alle hören können. Ich hoffe, das ist der Fall. Und damit können wir dann jetzt auch beginnen. Guten Abend allerseits, herzlich willkommen zum Transatlantic Tuesday des Carl-Schurz-Hauses. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal. Ich begleite Sie heute Abend durch den Abend mit Emily Tamkin unter dem Titel The Influence of Soros and the Future of Jewish America. Ganz kurz zur Technik. Lassen Sie bitte Ihre Mikrofone ausgeschaltet, damit die Audioqualität nicht leidet. Am Ende gibt es noch die Möglichkeit, ein paar Fragen zu stellen. Die Videos können Sie gerne anlassen, wenn Sie möchten. Ja, worum geht es heute Abend? Der erschreckende abermalige Aufstieg des extremen Antisemitismus in Amerika und überall auf der Welt, genauer gesagt der Neonazi-Aufmarsch in Charlottesville, Virginia, dessen grauenhafte Parole „Die Juden werden uns nicht ersetzen" lautete, hat nicht nur nach eigener Aussage ganz unmittelbar zur Kandidatur des neuen US-Präsidenten Joe Biden um das Weiße Haus geführt. Die gesamte amerikanische Gesellschaft und ihre jüdischen Bürgerinnen und Bürger müssen sich insgesamt mit dem politischen Nachlass der Trump-Jahre auseinandersetzen, in denen der oberste Republikaner sich als engster Verbündeter Israels gab, die US-Botschaft nach Jerusalem versetzen ließ, das werden Sie wissen, daheim aber den radikalen antisemitischen Kräften im Land und im eigenen Lager freie Hand ließ. Was folgte, waren rechtsextreme Terroranschläge wie der auf eine Synagoge in Pittsburgh in 2018, die wiederholten sich bald auch in Deutschland. In der Rhetorik autoritärer Politiker und ihrer Wählerschaft wurde der jüdisch-amerikanische Milliardär George Soros, ein 89-jähriger Philanthrop mit ungarischen Wurzeln, zum Schreckgespenst schriller Verschwörungstheorien. Emily Tamkin, leitende US-Redakteurin des Wochenmagazins The New Statesman und Moderatorin des dazugehörigen Podcasts World Review, verfolgt nicht nur die amerikanische Außen- und Politik für das Blatt und hat als jüdische Amerikanerin auch die Zukunft ihrer Gemeinschaft fest im Blick. Sie legt mit ihrem Sachbuch The Influence of Soros, Politics, Power and the Struggle for an Open Society auch das neue Standardwerk über das einmalig bewegte Leben des US-Großinvestors und seine späte zweite Karriere als ultimativer Buhmann und ärgstes Feindbild der reaktionären Rechten vor. Tamkin berichtete bereits für Foreign Policy, BuzzFeed News, The New Republic, Politico, The Economist und die Washington Post. Im indischen Neu-Delhi arbeitete die Autorin als Stipendiatin des Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs. Davor lebte sie als Fulbright-Stipendiatin in deutschen Bremen. Derzeit schreibt Tamkin in Washington, D.C. an ihrem nächsten Buch Bad Jews. In 2022 wird es erscheinen über die konfliktreiche, komplexe Geschichte und die sowohl traditionsbewusste als auch hochdynamische Identität des jüdischen Amerika. Welcome, Emily. It's a true pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me here, Renee. And thank you all so much for taking some time out of your evening to come listen to me speak about Soros and the United States and American Jews. I appreciate you all being here.
Thanks. I would like to start with something I have already mentioned in German. So when Joe Biden, the new US president, we all have to get used to that still, to call him President Biden now, announced his candidacy for president like many, many years ago. It feels like in a campaign video, as people do now. He told people that he decided to run again at his ripe old age. It wasn't like a foregone conclusion at this point, after and because of Charlottesville and what happened there. So I've already mentioned neo-Nazis screamed things like Jews will not replace us there. I was quite struck by this direct connection to Jewish life in America and the danger and peril of anti-Semitism. And I was wondering if you yourself were surprised about this argument and the decision it led to.
I was not surprised that he would pick that out in particular, because it was such a striking day in this country, and because I think that I mean, what he was saying when he said, I ran because of Charlottesville, was he was using Charlottesville as like a stand-in for, I'm running because the person who's currently the most powerful person in the country has made it okay for people to get out in the streets and chant, Jew will not replace us, and to feel comfortable doing that, to feel empowered doing that, to feel that there was a place in our political discourse for that. You know, and the fact that after Charlottesville, Trump did not condemn it wholeheartedly, but instead said there were very fine people on both sides, and then had the audacity to go back and say that he had never said that. To me, and you know, we should be clear that that day was not only harrowing to American Jews. Certainly for Black Americans, it was taken as a direct threat, right? For anybody who's not in the majority, racially or religiously or ethnically, it was in some way threatening. But certainly American Jews were one community who were impacted by that. And I think that what Biden was saying was that it is not acceptable to have a president who's not just who has as part of his platform, but whose main platform is stoking those divisions. And I think you saw that especially even more so in Trump's re-election campaign than his original election campaign, right? He was really running on this us versus them, nativist, and yes, anti-Semitic campaign.
It's kind of interesting when I watched the video, which didn't impress me much back in 2019 because it didn't look as sleek as what Hillary Clinton had in 2016. It was Joe Biden, like a bit corny in its graphics, but the argument was quite strong. And I was struck by, I mean, people on Twitter, where people talk about politics these days, they made fun of the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, like holding tiki fire, I don't know the English term, to be honest.
They're tiki torches, we call them.
Yeah, I was missing torches there. And making fun of this, like, of course, desperate fun, but still fun in a way, of this tacky way of restaging like a Nazi parade in a way. And I was quite struck that Joe Biden must look at this in a very different way from a perspective that's still connected to the Second World War in a way, and what America had to do back then. I was wondering if this is a time for somebody in the White House who has this kind of historical perspective on the 20th century, which is slipping away, I think, in time.
That's a great point, and it's actually not one, to be honest, it's not one that I've thought of before, that the advantage that Joe Biden had from having that historical memory. Although we should note that Trump himself was not a young man, and that many other candidates in the Democratic Party were also, just to be very frank, quite old. But Joe Biden was the one who ran on this platform of restoring decency, where you had other Democratic candidates who were much more future-oriented in some ways. I think you're right to say that Biden was the one who was deliberately hearkening back to the past. But I also want to just go back to something that you said about making a kind of desperate fun. I think it's an important phrase, right? The combination of the two. It's something that one sees a lot on social media, particularly with respect to anti-Semitism, right? There's a Jewish museum now that sells shirts that have like the Jewish Space Agency on it, because this congresswoman had made a Facebook post about how climate change or fires in California were inspired by a space laser from the Rothschild, this Jewish banking family. So they have these shirts. People always joke about like, at my Jew committee meeting, and actually after Charlottesville, I can remember my father saying about Jew will not replace us. He was like, you think I want to replace you? You're marching with tiki torches. It's this very defensive humor. And it really, I think I used to do it too. And to be honest, I don't anymore, because it really breaks my heart every time, right? That people feel that people have to cope in this way. Like, I don't want to joke about lasers. I don't want to joke about the tiki torches. I don't want to joke about like my international cabal. I don't think it's funny, because I think that it's actually speaking to something quite dangerous. And I don't want to I'm kind of at the point where now, after the last 4 years, I don't want to make light of it.
Yeah, and some theory of current politics also talks about this idea of the horror clown now in charge. Like, it's really easy to mistake this kind of dark humor that figures like Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene, whom you've just mentioned, exude, and it's so easy to make fun of them, and it's so easy to overlook what they really stand for. And of course they mean it. We shouldn't.
I think that's right. That it's the seriousness of the ridiculous thing that they're saying or doing. And you know, she put out this her new thing. Marjorie Taylor Greene will say, "Well, I never said Jewish space laser. You know, I said Rothschild." And this is another kind of trope that we see often in American politics today, at least, is that people will use these kind of stand-ins, right? So they won't say Jewish, they'll say Rothschild, or they'll say, you know, these New York media communist billionaires. And it's like, well, who are you talking about? I know who you mean. And I think it's very, you know, there's a debate here in the States right now about how we define anti-Semitism and what it means and whether we should be focused on it, or is it too narrow to just look at anti-Semitism? And something that I think is really important in talking about anti-Semitism today in the 21st century American context is that what it does is perpetuates the idea of the Jew as the other, right, as foreign, as not a part of society, but as nevertheless having control of it and wanting to subvert it and undermine it from within. It overassigns agencies to Jewish people, which is dangerous for us. And it also, another thing that you have often here is that it takes away that agency from others, right? So when you have people say, you know, George Soros is paying for Black Lives Matter protests, you're taking that power away from people who are protesting on their own accord for Black life, right? And against police violence and state-backed violence. When you say, the shooting in Pittsburgh, at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was inspired, we know, from the shooter's own writings, because the synagogue had helped through Hias, the refugee organization, fundraise for refugee aid. You know, when you say, well, these Jews are bringing in migrants, you're completely overlooking all of the reasons that migrants and refugees and asylum seekers come to this country. And that, I think, is dangerous too, right? It's not just that it villainizes Jews, it also takes power away from all of these other people and robs them of their place in the political conversation. So that was my rant on that.
I think it's quite interesting and quite apt. So I was going to mention the Tree of Life synagogue massacre in October of 2018 again, of course. One could also mention months of attacks against Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn in 2019. There was a shooting at the, I hope I say this right, Shabbat of Poway in California in April of the same year. And what it puts in my mind is that like acts of extreme violence against American Jews have kind of punctured our perception of Jewish life in the US abroad, I would say. And of course, as a German, I look at this with quite some awareness, obviously. Of course, similar things have happened here now as well, but things always seem magnified in the US, at least to Germans, I would think. And I was wondering how you would describe the current outlook of the community itself and how life-changing these 4 years of Trumpism and what it allowed to be said and done would feel to them.
I would say 3 things about this. I think this is especially surprising for people of like my parents' generation, who were, who were not alive necessarily during the Second World War and don't have a memory of that. And so whose entire life has been the story of American Jewish assimilation and acculturation and safety and security. And to have this happen, this kind of open anti-Semitism happen well into your adult years, I think is quite striking for many people. The second thing I would say is that I don't think this came from nowhere. I was always keenly aware of anti-Semitism growing up. The surprising thing to me is how openly it's embraced by political leaders. And the third thing I would say is that you mentioned the Jewish community, and I think that this is a controversial statement, so I'm only speaking for myself when I say this, not for other American Jews, which is my point. I think of it as that there are more Jewish American communities, right? Like there's no one way that people see this. And this is important because there are people on the political right who say, well, the real problem with anti-Semitism is on the left, and people who are critical of Israel. And they kind of will sometimes explain away comments that are very offensive to me that certain Republican politicians make, because those same Republican politicians are great friends of Israel. There are people on the left who say, well, we shouldn't, Israel's not here, and further, there's no position on Israel that excuses anti-Semitism here. And also, we think that you should be rethinking your policy toward Israel anyway, right? So there's a conference going on now here in the States called J Street, where several politicians have come out and talked about conditioning or putting some limits on aid to Israel. So that's a conversation, right? And then there are people who say that even the term anti-Semitism now is so meaningless because it means, right, because different people get upset at different tropes or different moments, or and so one wonders how does one even have a conversation on it when we all have such different understandings, and when people and to be clear, I don't actually think that it's a problem that people have different understandings, right? Jewishness is an identity, and identity is something that's so deeply personal, right? It's shaped by your family, by your class, by your race, by your community, by the neighborhood you live in, et cetera, et cetera. What I do think is a problem is that various people will claim to speak for the American Jews, right? And for all of the reasons that I've just outlined, I don't really think that anybody has a right to do that. This isn't the UK or France. There's no head rabbi in the United States. There's literally no one Jewish leader in this country. And so anybody who kind of claims that mantle, I think personally, is wrong to do so.
Yeah. Still, I'm wondering if that is is it an advantage or something positive, or does it also have its downsides sometimes, because there is no authority to at least sometimes suggest that there is such a thing as a community that could speak on something as one, basically, even if it's always fictional to some degree.
This is a very American answer, I think, but I personally think it's a good thing that we have this discussion and debate is forced. I think Judaism as a tradition is one that's based on questioning and discussion and debate. And so in some ways it's quite fitting that we have this, and I personally like that there are alternatives to mainstream institutional American Jewishness and what that's meant at different times. So for example, at the back in the early 20th century, you had the American Jewish Committee, which was established by elite American Jews who had maybe been here a little longer, or whose families had been here longer, and who kind of wanted to separate, guide the newer immigrants and Eastern European Jewish immigrants and say how things should be or shouldn't be. And the American Jewish Congress was founded in opposition to that, as kind of more of a mass organization, or more of not progressive, but more of a maybe it was more in touch with more people, at least at that point. And I like that about American Jewish history, right? That one people will say this, and then another group will say, well, wait a minute, we're going to course correct and come over here. And I just think at this point, the question of, they did try to bring over a head rabbi in the late 19th century, because from Lithuania, because there were concerns that people didn't have enough structure, and it didn't work. Right? Even the Orthodox Jews were like, this is too much. We don't want this person telling us what to do. And so, at this point, we're 150 years after that. So it's, even if that would have been better, it's too late for us American Jews. We're too far gone down this direction of anarchy. No, I'm kidding. Of cacophony, let's call it.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I just came up with the question because I read a piece in the Atlantic about Mormonism, actually, and its 100 years history. And one of the things that was mentioned in the article was that Mormons don't have any cultural cachet, but of course that's not at all something that one could say about Jewish America, and it's quite the opposite, of course. So I think I would agree with your point. So looking back to the former guy, as the current president now calls his predecessor, and this weird double bind he created that you've already mentioned, that he was always seen to be like fervently supporting Israel in its current political condition as a Netanyahu-led right-wing country. One can say that, I think. He was moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That seems to be for good now. Joe Biden is not gonna send it back to Tel Aviv, I think. So much is clear. But Trump was also creating a social climate of hate and fear and of anti-Semitism, amongst other things. And one thing I was trying to look back on while preparing for this that seems quite symbolic as a gesture to me, even though it also created political realities, was that Trump signed an executive order, that's such a hard word to say, wow, German, to fight anti-Semitism on college campuses. And he was accompanied by two evangelical pastors known for extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric, good Lord. And this struck me as so insane, but also so vividly illustrating this weird double space that he created in American politics. I mean, of course, it came of age in the years before Trump came to Washington, I think. I mean, we still remember Netanyahu aligning with the Republicans against Obama in broad daylight in 2014, I think it was. But Trump really took the cake, I think.
I think he made something that was already happening a lot clearer. And I think because many American, I mean, 60 to 70% of American Jews somewhere in there voted against Trump both times. So we should just, note that. But I think because so many American Jews did find Trump so offensive, and Trump was so tightly embracing Netanyahu, it creates this very interesting, I mean, you could use many adjectives to describe this, but interesting is one. This really interesting moment where you have Trump saying, well, I love Israel, and American Jews saying, well, that's not what we're talking about right now, right? Well, first of all, you love a very particular Israeli government.
Yeah.
And a very particular political constellation in Israel. And second of all, if your idea of fighting anti-Semitism is telling students who support BDS on college campuses that they can't, when our country protects free speech and the right to boycott, whether you agree with it or not, that's their protected right. I don't really see how that makes me, as a Jewish woman, safer. And so if we're, this was the debate, we're having this debate now, ongoing debate on the definition of anti-Semitism that various institutions should adopt. And this one, which is by Ira, and even the creator of it has said, I didn't mean it to be used as policy. One criticism of it is that it's so focused on Israel and on speech around Israel in a way that is both too broad, because any speech against Israel can be accused of being anti-Semitic. And it's also too narrow, because then you have all these other things that we've been talking about that are either excused or just not dealt with. So yes, I think it's an interesting contradiction. And I think, it's tricky because on the one hand, you can say, well, and this goes back, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that there's no one person who can kind of come down and say well, this is it, because different American Jews feel differently about it, right? There are some people who love the IRA definition and who think that it should be used. There are other people who think that has no place in policymaking institutions. You you have Reform Judaism, which is the largest denomination here in the States. The official Reform Jewish group said that they were accepting the definition, but didn't think that it should be implemented as policy. So you have all these debates. And I do think, maybe we were headed here anyway, but I do think that exactly what you said, this sort of Trump and Netanyahu embrace, and Trump being so vocal in support of Israel, while saying to Republican Jews, oh, you won't support me because I don't want your money, and while referring to Netanyahu as American Jews prime minister, like while doing all of this, to me, I think that hastened some of these conversations.
Yeah, and I mean, we shouldn't forget how, like everything, how the relationship to Israel and to American Jews, how transactional it was to Trump. Like, I mean, when I was researching for this, like, I had forgotten half the anti-Semitic things Trump openly said, and he still expected Jewish support, of course, in both elections, and was quite disappointed when it didn't turn out to be.
I think people really thought that it was going to be like that, and it's. And to be fair, I don't think that American Jews are the only group that you saw this play out with, right? You also had, for example, Trump and Modi, the Prime Minister of India, had rallies both here and in India. And I think that there were people who thought that that was going to be the thing that, got Indian Americans to vote for Trump in large number, and they didn't. And, part of the reason is that Indian Americans, like Jewish Americans, live here, not in India, not in Israel. We may have our own thoughts about the governments in either of those countries. It's even different in that, like, Indian Americans, at least you can say, well, that's a diaspora. So most people have a direct connection to that country. I'm not Israeli.
Yeah.
I'm a Jewish American person. I have thoughts on Israel, but I only have one passport. And so you cutting aid to Palestinian refugees, like that is not an issue that I would vote in favor of. There are American Jews who would, but they are in the minority, and I don't think that was fully understood by the Trump administration.
Still, it kind of seems to me that there are like two, at least. I mean, they're not the main thing, as you pointed out, but there are kind of two messy breakups going on in a way. You already said, like, 70 to 75%, I've even seen, of American Jews were planning to vote against Trump in October of 2020. And at the same time, Orthodox Jews in the United States were a bit more drawn to Trump. The main argument was, of course, despite the social climate he caused, the idea was fear of more hostility from an Israel skeptic Democratic left, which is ascendant in the Democratic Party, of course, would be even worse for life in the US. That's the one thing. And at the same time, the second messy breakup is the one, in a way, between American Jews as a whole, as a big group, and Jews in Israel, who were, I think, 70% for Trump. And I remember I was in Israel in 2017, quite at the beginning of this whole love affair between Trump and Netanyahu, and Jerusalem was plastered with giant Trump banners. Trump was everywhere, and it felt like they were jubilant about this. Could you comment on both breakups?
Yeah, I mean, I think here it's probably more a spectrum than a binary. I think that there are, I should first of all say that the idea that that this administration is anti-Israel is sort of funny to me, and that Joe Biden was not one of the candidates who was out there saying, yes, we're going to condition aid to Israel, and I think has a long history of being more unconditionally supportive than some progressives would like. But anyway, but yes, there are people in the Democratic Party who are more critical of Israel, or who would say, that just saying yes to whatever Netanyahu wants, that's not necessarily pro-Israel, if you're thinking about like what is good for the long-term benefit of this country. But fine, but I think there are people in Israel who would turn around and say, well, who are you to decide what's good for the long-term benefit of our country? Which is fair, except that then don't tell American Jews that they have to vote for Trump, right? So I think there's a lot of talking past one another. between Israeli Jews and American Jews. And I don't know that will change. And I don't mean to sound cynical, but I think that, they're different experiences. Most American Jews, how can I put this? American Jews are living in a country where the project is, if not assimilation, then different cultures living together, whereas, Israel is an explicitly Jewish nation state. So those are inherently different political experiences that will be interpreted and lived differently by the two groups. I think, to me, the traditionally Orthodox, there's the traditionally Orthodox, modern Orthodox, and conservative Reconstruction Reform. And yes, the way a traditionally Orthodox person lives in this country is very different from the way that I live. And I think that some traditionally Orthodox people would say that that they're the ones who are most visibly Jewish, and they're the victims of most hate crimes, and they should have, and maybe other Jews don't feel a kinship with them or don't feel like they have to defend them. And I think that there are some Jews who are not Orthodox who would turn around and say, well, do you even think of me as Jewish? And so, again, as with all matters of identity, it's so personal and fraught. And I know that that's not an answer as to how we get around it, but I'm not going to say that I'm here, I've solved the conflicts in Jewish identity, because I haven't, and indeed I'm not, to be honest, I'm not trying to do that. But you're right, I think there are these, I wouldn't say it's two divorces, I would say that there are many schisms. And we could bring in, European Jews, and how the debate over Israel versus anti-Semitism on the left and right is different in the UK or in Germany, or and so on and so forth, and forever and ever.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, I think. And of course, I was trying to make a point which is easier than the whole picture looks. So I think you're right to correct that. Before I want to get the conversation a little bit more in direction of your book, I have one last question, which seems to me quite specific to America, in contrast to Europe, maybe, for now at least, and that is this whole idea underpinning the conservative and rights relationship to Israel in the United States, which is quite interconnected with evangelical ideas about the end times, obviously, and the coming kingdom of God. And this always struck me as a very, to be honest, very creepy kind of connection. And it was very present in the White House because Mike Pence was there, who is a deeply faithful evangelical Christian, who I think firmly believes in these kinds of stories. And they seem to ground support for Israel in a way that isn't very helpful politically or culturally, I think. Would you?
Well, it's helpful to them.
Yeah.
Right? It's not particularly helpful to me. But Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State, is also a deeply devout Christian who also had this connection to Israel, went there toward the very end of his time as Secretary of State. I'm sure if he runs for president, we'll mention his close ties to Israel. And I think that's all well and good for Mike Pence. I would raise the question as to whether that's particularly useful for Jewish Americans, and whether Mike Pence would create conditions that, that like Trump, saw a tangible rise in anti-Semitic hate crime.
Yeah, I would like to introduce the book of the hour at this point, which is The Influence of Soros, and the topic of conversation for the next minutes. I was quite fascinated you choose this figure who's so fraught in political discourse right now for your first book, quite honestly, because it would, the mere thought of wading into this is terrifying to me, because Soros has such a second career of being blamed for absolutely everything on earth, that it seems quite challenging to dissect this from years into this. I mean, whole elections have been run exclusively of opposing Soros, who's not a citizen of said countries.
Mm-hmm.
So was it challenging to you?
I have to say, scarier to me or more intimidating to me is the book that I'm writing now, which is just about like average American Jews. So no, comparatively, that was not hard or intimidating. But you know, I got into it because I was a foreign policy journalist, and I wrote often about Russia and Central Eastern Europe because of my academic background. And I ended up writing in 2017 a piece on Soros because he was everywhere, right? He was like, and Hungary was kicking CEU out, and they're campaigning against him. And so the point of the piece was to ask the question, how did he become the specter haunting Europe? And a year later, I went to write a similar piece at a different publication. And by this time, it was the 2018 midterms. And it was like, oh my goodness, this has come here. You know, the same things that I was writing about in Hungary and Romania and Slovakia, where I was now hearing in my own country about migrant caravans. And Soros was sent a pipe bomb, and it was, you know, and so then you step back and ask, okay, well, how did this happen, right? What is the full sort of global story, and what has this person actually done? How is that different from what people say he's done? And why is it so tempting to people to conflate the two, right? Why is it politically useful to them? And I think the reason, ultimately, the reason that his project, his philanthropic project, is so so like tempting to his critics is that, for whatever else you can say about him critically, and I think there's a fair amount, his philanthropic project is explicitly about ensuring that society is civically and not ethnically operating, right? That you know, all of us can take place in this discussion, not because we're of the same religion or the same race or the same nationality, but because we've all elected to take part in the discussion and the debate, and through that conversation can try to reach a better understanding. That is a very, to some people, that's a very scary and threatening thing. And politicians know that that's a scary, threatening thing, and can use that to get people out to vote, building him up instead of building their actual political opponents up, right? So instead of having to debate whoever is running against them for prime minister, they can have this debate with Soros, who's not there, right? Because he's not running for office.
Yeah. So before trying to get into his remarkable biography a little bit more, I wanted to mention to people that they can already type questions into the chat for the very end of this, where we can pick one or two audience questions for the end of our talk. So if you're not a fast typer, you would want to start now, I think. And
if I'm speaking too quickly, you can also type in the chat, slow down. This has happened to me before at events, so don't feel badly about telling me to speak more slowly. Anyway.
Yeah, the same thing happens to me, actually. I always talk way too fast. So you've pointed out before that the book is not only a biography of this one man, which is important to point out, I think, but it's an exploration, of course, of how he's influenced the world, which is in a considerable way, obviously. But looking back at this life, which I didn't know too much about, if I'm being honest, he's a person that's been looked at from a very contemporary perspective by many people, I think. It kind of struck me that his life was this kind of existential ethical struggle in a way, because like the question is, what should someone who went through the worst historic catastrophe in human life and history, I would say, and became insanely rich, I mean, the likelihood of that is not particularly high, through sometimes questionable means, as you have already pointed out. He amassed a fortune that no person on earth needs, in a way. What should he do with his life and with these kinds of riches if he wants to make the world a better place than the world he had in childhood, basically? And I was kind of wondering if that's something that actually makes him more vulnerable to attack now, because people like to point out that this is like an epic struggle gone wrong?
I think a couple things make him vulnerable to attack. Three things, actually. The first is that, especially in Europe, at the beginning of his philanthropic journey, everyone heard the name Soros, but nobody really knew where the money was coming from. And this was by design, because Soros himself had been a recipient of funding and had kind of learned how to game the philanthropic system. And he didn't want that happening to his own philanthropy. And so at the beginning, especially in Hungary, they tried to keep it sort of mysterious and have this almost magical quality to it, right? But the flip side of that is that if people don't if people don't know you and they don't really know, like, okay, at every 3 months we give out this grant and this is how it's assigned and blah, 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 then that can be used against you. You know, this woman I spoke to in Romania said, you know, she was like, some of us from a certain generation, everybody of a certain like intellectual milieu had a Soros scholarship, and it was more money than they'd ever had in their lives. And they went to Scotland and they went to England and then, you know, they to Germany, and they came back with these foreign ideas. And so the name Soros took on this connotation for some people. That's useful. The second thing I already said, it's that he has this, well, the second thing is that he has four things. The second thing is this political project this philanthropic project about civic versus ethnic. The third is that he is both a political donor and a philanthropic donor, and he's both in the same country, which is the United States. I think if you look here, you really start hearing like anti-Soros conspiracies in 2004, which was when he became involved in political giving. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have done that. I am saying that if you are a political donor in a supercharged partisan space and you are a philanthropic donor, the one will color the other, even though it's two separate like pots of money and open society is not writing the political checks. And then lastly, I asked a man in Slovakia, I said, why is he this bogeyman? And he said, Emily, you could not think of a more cartoonish villain in terms of identity, right? In terms of he's Hungarian. So in Hungary, that means that he's the Hungarian who left. In Slovakia and Romania, it's like, well, Hungary is the ethnic minority for some of them, so they have their own connotations. He lives in New York. He works in finance and you know, is maybe the most famous currency speculator in the world. So that's suspect to people. And he's Jewish, which, to go back from the beginning of our conversation, you can say things if you're, for example, Mr. Orban, like, we're fighting an enemy who's different from us. He's, you know, wandering and rootless and works in finance. Like, he doesn't need to say Jewish, but everybody hears that and they fill in their own connotations, you know. And there's a scene in the book where I interview his spokesperson, and the spokesperson says, well, our problem isn't that he's Jewish. Of course not. Like, we love Israel. Our problem is that he's a globalist. Well, globalist is recognized around the world as a stand-in for Jewish. But they've figured out, and I think all around the world people have done this, they've figured out a way to criticize him without saying the word. And the other thing, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that then you have Netanyahu's son putting out what are, by any account, like horribly anti-Semitic cartoons about Soros, and people will turn around and say, well, he's, you know, look, the Netanyahus don't like Soros. But again, it's the same, you know, just because it's Israel doesn't mean that there aren't politicians who want an ethnic instead of civic-based version of society. And I think one could argue that that's the vision that certainly Yair Netanyahu is putting forth. And so this is, for these four reasons, I think there's something about that combination that just makes him a lightning rod for this kind of negative attention. And you're right, I think people today, you know, they hear Soros and they think like, oh, that's the guy who Republicans blame everything on, and don't know, you know, that he survived the Holocaust, went to the LSE, studied under Karl Popper, made all this money in finance, decides to give back to open society because of Karl Popper, starts in South Africa, goes to Hungary, goes to Russia. You know, this whole history is just not known to people. So part of the reason that I wanted to write the book is that I do think that, and write the book about him, is that I do think that there's something about this story that we can use as a way in to these other debates about how we live now, right? About who gets to take part in democracy. You know, can you have an open society and have billionaires? You know, what does it mean when somebody blames a Jewish person for hijacking democracy? Like, why does that matter? Why are we so vilifying immigrants? You can have all of these conversations through the study of Soros.
Yeah, you've already brought it up, but Hungarian history, as well as its contemporary politics, is quite important to the life of Soros, and I think of the person he became. And I was wondering if you've read the book by, the most recent book by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Susan Faludi, In the Dark Room.
No, I haven't. I will after this talk, though.
Well, it's a memoir because she also has Jewish Hungarian roots. Her father actually escaped there from the Holocaust as well, from the Nazis, and landed in the United States and went back to Hungary actually as a woman in the 21st century and lives there now and is a fervent Orban supporter and supporter. And in a way that struck me as an even more hypercharged version of Soros's story and of this very conflicted way of looking at national history now. And I was wondering if Hungary's history is particularly alive today again, and people just look back at all of these things that happened hundreds of years ago or 100 years ago, or is that something that's coming back all over the world for you?
Well, I think the reason that it's particularly alive is that the government there is intentionally bringing up certain episodes and rewriting them in some senses as part of their political project. And I think that is happening all over the world as well. You see that, you certainly saw it here in the United States under Trump. You see it to a certain extent in places like India. Yeah, I think it's something that politicians do often is take national memory and recreate. So in Hungary's case, basically the story is that in World War II, despite Hungary's early alliance with the Nazis, and then throughout the Cold War, that Hungary was the victim. And the reason for this is that if you are the victim, it's not your fault, right? Like, things just happen to you. It wasn't that your government decided to ally with Hitler. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is you were occupied by the Nazis. And never mind that then after they were gone, the Aerocross took over, right? Like, let's not talk about that. I think that especially in Eastern Europe, this there's another part of the book where basically it's a relayed anecdote, but that Kovacs, the spokesperson, says, for Hungarian Jews, the Holocaust was the worst tragedy, but for the rest of Hungary, it was the Treaty of Trianon, which was the treaty after World War I through which Hungary lost much of its territory. And to me, the thing that's really sad about that is that before that, Hungarian Jews just thought of themselves as Hungarians, right? Like, these were some of the most assimilated Jews in Europe. They had been part of the Hungarian nationalization project. Many of them had deep pride in the Hungarian nation and language. And you've decided instead that they're the reason that you lost all your territory and you're going to blame them. And I think more broadly throughout, especially Central and Eastern Europe, because there's been so much loss and suffering over the course of the 20th century, and I don't mean to belittle that at all, right? Like, people suffered, all sorts of people suffered throughout Europe in the 20th century, absolutely. But saying that Jewish people also suffered doesn't take away from that. And I think that this is, you see this all over the world, right? That it's like, well, my group suffered. And I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm saying that so did this other group, and that acknowledging that doesn't take away from your suffering at all. I think especially, for example, in Poland today, this conversation about collaboration and et cetera, is very fraught. And there too, it's like, the government is making it a fraught political issue. That's a choice. Like, how we how we learn and remember history doesn't have to be a political choice, but it can be. And I think very often governments try to make it so. And, we had right before, like, this is not a uniquely European phenomenon. At the end of Trump's term, you had the Trump administration basically put out a curriculum saying that America's past needs to be remembered as patriotic and great. And we had slavery, and we had Jim Crow, and we had horrible immigration policies that were and are in many ways openly racist. And that does not to take away from the wonderful things that the country did, but it did a lot of harm to other Americans and to people around the world. And I don't think that we should encourage citizens. I basically think no matter what country you're in, you should not encourage citizens to shy away from looking at the harms committed within that history.
Yeah, I think actually what's very kind of telling about this whole problem is that while all nations are obsessed by their own history now, and politics gets drawn from that in very irresponsible ways, at the same time academic historians are just the rates are collapsing, it's the graphs are insane, there will be no historians left in 20 years, I think. And I think that's quite telling about what you can do with history if you do it right, if you're very unscrupulous about it and just have your way of telling a story that might be more light than any kind of history. You can be wildly successful, and I think no country is immune to that. And something I would like to connect to your book about this is actually the whole Orban and Hungary phenomenon seems quite exotic in a way still to many Germans, I think, what happened there over just a few years. But it's actually intimately connected to, of course, to Austrian politics. They are very much in talks. We've, over the weekend, we almost had a chancellor here who's best friends with Orban in a way. So our Bavarian state party who has close ties to him. So this will be coming back if we don't look out, I think. And something that closes the book, which kind of surprised me, is that you're quite conclusive in saying there will never be another Soros, that he was a product of a particular time, of particular circumstances. Of course, that's of course true if you look at the history of finance, and he got famous for breaking the Bank of England and stuff like that. And you also say if open society, the big project of his life, is actually to be successful, there shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is that something that you started the book with, or is that the conclusion after researching and writing it?
I think both. But it definitely was reaffirmed through the writing of the book. I just think that if your project is a society in which we all can take part in discussion and debate, you can't be a billionaire, because it just and especially in the United States where wealth inequality is so dramatic, you're just, when you put and you can say, I'm just here as another participant, but when you put your thumb on the scale, it just completely changes. And I think on some level, Soros gets this too. It's why he's calling for a wealth tax. I think that a society that is as socioeconomically just inequitable as the United States is cannot be an open one. And so we can't see these two things as separate. You can't have the socio without the economic, if that makes sense. If we're going to have everybody included in the one, they necessarily need to be all included in the other. And we can't do that if all the wealth and with it all of the power is concentrated. Yeah.
I would like to give you Stephen Beckhofer's question, who thanks you for your thoughts and asks you, one question that comes to mind is how you think the various schisms that provide fuel for anti-Semitism in the US can be bridged. So going back to what we already talked about.
So, I mean, between different types of Jewish people, those schisms. I think, I do think that that people who are interested in, this is something that I, especially as I write my current book, have tried to do, is to educate myself on different types of lived Jewish experiences. I I think that institutional American Jewishness needs to take a much broader idea of what it is to be Jewish in America. For many years, and still, you know, there's the leader of one of these Jewish American organizations said that what keeps him up at night is intermarriage, because he doesn't want the Jewish community to be dying out. And I think that that's, you know, my husband's not Jewish and we're going to raise our children Jewish. And if that's a problem for you, I invite you to not be the head of a Jewish American organization, right? Like that's just such a limited way of thinking about how to create a meaningful experience for a Jewish American person in the United States. So I think broadening that, like really, you know, for years they did these studies and they would ask people like, how many times do you do Shabbat? Do you light the candles? Do you like, how often do you go to shul? And they didn't ask them what it meant to them or how it made people feel or how people wanted to be a part of this community or if they felt a part of the community or what part of the community they felt, right? And I think that like a more inclusive Jewish America within which these different communities are in conversation with each other will be built on that kind of introspection and that kind of meeting. And the other thing I would say about schisms is that I think very often we'll talk about, and this is, I was trying to get at this earlier on, but I think often, you know, we'll talk about anti-Semitism or we'll talk about anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or, you know, xenophobia or Islamophobia. And the more, you know, and I don't mean this is kind of like a cliched kumbaya thing. The more I study anti-Semitism, the more I realize that it is directly in conversation with these other forms of hatred. I think today, the way we see it weaponized is explicitly to not just villainize Jewish people, but to denigrate other people, be those Black Americans or immigrants or Muslims or what have you. And I think that anybody who's either of these groups or interested in fighting oppression and marginalization should see these not as like, I can only care about one, but see them as being in conversation with one another and seeing as the solution to that as being conversations about the solutions as being in conversation with one another as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite proven by now because I still remember conversations in German media and public discourse in the aughts, as we call them now, about how Muslims are now the new Jews and Jews don't get blamed for anything anymore, but it's now the Muslims. And just a decade later, we can experience, people blame both again. So
yeah, I was once doing an interview where he was asking me about anti-Semitism and I kept trying to connect it to these different things. And at the end, the interviewer said, he was like, well, do you not just want to focus on, like, are you afraid of talking too much about anti-Semitism? And I said, it's not that, it's that I think that if you really want to talk about it in the way that it's present now, you have to connect it to these other things, right? Because it doesn't exist in isolation. It doesn't work in isolation. And I also think that like, we don't need to compete for oppressions, you know?
Yeah.
I do think that there are some Jewish Americans who are like, well, we're not talking enough about the Jews, which is they're entitled to feel that way. But I think it's more productive to see it as part of this larger conversation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's also, yeah, Stephen says, thank you for your empathetic and introspective response to his.
Well, thank you for the question.
I would like to point out to people that Emily's book, The Influence of Soros, can also be ordered in Germany, as I have illustrated. Local shops, for example, in Freiburg, Jos Fritz can get it for you. Emily has another book coming out in 2022, I think, called Bad Jews. You can also subscribe to the New Statesman, to the magazine she's working for, which is also worthwhile from Germany, because the reportage, especially in world affairs, is excellent. Your colleague, Jeremy Cliff, has just predicted our next chancellor. So
Jeremy is based in Berlin, so he is quite good on German coverage as well.
Yeah, and you can read Emily's pieces there as well. There's also digital subscriptions, so whatever your fancy is, you can get it. And for free, you can also listen to World Review, the podcast Emily and Jeremy Cliff are doing every week on Friday. And I enjoy it hugely. I'm very glad it exists. And if you want to feel very informed on world affairs, you should subscribe to World Review. And with that, thank you so much, Emily, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, thank you all for taking the time on your Tuesday evening to hear me. So, vielen Dank.
And before we close the evening, I would just like to say 2 sentences in German to you about the next program für Mai und Juni. Wir setzen die Transatlantic Tuesdays fort, unter anderem mit Constanze Stelzenmüller, der bekannten US-Expertin von der Brookings Institution. Ich spreche mit dem berühmten britischen Historiker Tom Holland über The Making of the Western Mind, über die Geschichte des Christentums und wie es unsere Gegenwart bis heute formt. Wir haben Stephen Wertheim zu Gast, den Emily actually in meine Gedanken gebracht hat, der eine ganz neue amerikanische Außenpolitik entworfen hat. Und ein großes Highlight, wir sprechen zu der Friedenspreisträgerin und Bestsellerautorin Caroline Emke, die gerade überall ist mit ihrem Journal über die Corona-Epidemie. Und sie wird ins Gespräch kommen mit Daniel Mendelssohn, den wir 2019 schon zu Gast hatten, denn die beiden sind gut befreundet und werden einen Blick auf ein Jahr transatlantisches Leben mit Corona für uns wagen. And with that, thank you, Emily, thank you, everybody, and have a good night. Goodbye.